Thank you all so much again for joining us tonight. My name is Woody LaBounty. I'm the president and CEO of San Francisco Heritage. San Francisco Heritage is a nonprofit that's been around for, well, more than 50 years now, with a mission to preserve and enhance San Francisco's unique architectural and cultural identity. Tonight we have Kate Connor, who is the manager of housing implementation programs for the San Francisco Planning Department. Kate gave this presentation at the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Commission in December, I believe, and went through a lot of the new bills that have come into effect in 2024 and did a great job of giving me personally an overview of how these new laws intersect with preservation, how they consider it, how they impact it, and how in some cases maybe don't consider it enough. So I thought it would be great to bring Kate to a wider audience to discuss this. We also have Mr. Rich Sucre, who is a deputy director at the planning department. He is also in charge of historic preservation at the planning department. So he's hopefully going to be here to be able to answer some questions as they intersect with the preservation side of this. We have a couple of other folks from the planning department here, just kind of on standby on the bench in case they need to answer questions about the housing element, which is a very hot topic right now in San Francisco, and the rezoning that is going on and being planned right now. But hopefully, I think we're all set now. There's no fire in the house, and I think we can start our presentation. Kate, can I turn it over to you to start?
Absolutely. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much, Woody. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kate Connor. As Woody mentioned, I am the manager of the housing implementation programs for the planning department. As Woody mentioned, this is pretty much the same presentation that I've made to both the Planning Commission as well as the Historic Preservation Commission. I did add a couple of slides just regarding kind of an introduction to state density bonus, just in case there's some of you that are not familiar with that law, because there is a law that further amends state density bonus. And then finally, I realize there's going to be a lot of substance here, which is really indicative of kind of the immense amount of change that we've been going through for the last couple of years. And hopefully you'll find it somewhat helpful. Presentation's approximately 20 to 25 minutes, and then we can take questions. And with that, I can get to it. So this evening, I'm going to provide an overview of 5 pieces of state housing legislation that may affect the Planning Department or Planning Commission review of housing development projects in 2024. So I'm going to touch upon the following pieces of housing legislation. AB 2011, and that actually became effective in July of this year, or of last year. SB 423, which extends SB 35, but it's going to have a more expansive impact on San Francisco. SB 4, which allows for 100% affordable housing that's developed by nonprofit, religious, and higher education institutions. AB 1287, which modifies state density bonus law, and I've added a couple of slides for introduction about state density bonus law. And then finally, AB 1114, which governs and defines post-entitlement phase permits. So what are some of the trends that we saw this last session? There were over 60 housing bills that were signed by Governor Newsom. Topics included ministerial housing production programs, expanding state density bonus, tenant protection bills, homeless housing, CEQA, and accessory dwelling units. My focus this evening is really going to include the 5 bills that I mentioned, which really touch upon housing production programs, state density bonus, and building permit appeals. Each of the housing production bills provide for ministerial approval processes, and this means that there's no review under CEQA or discretionary entitlement, provided that all of the eligibility criteria are met. A reoccurring reference that's going to be throughout this presentation is going to be compliance with objective standards. Objective standards are those that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and being uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official. I realize it's a very hefty definition. It's a lot of words, but it is something that is constantly reoccurring in all of the state housing bills. For all of the housing production bills that I'm going to discuss tonight, projects must be considered code complying and meet all of these objective standards, with the understanding that state density bonus projects are also considered to be code complying. And as I mentioned a little bit later, state density bonus projects kind of have some built-in exceptions to planning code requirements. So the first bill is AB 2011. And this, again, was part of last year's legislative session, but it became effective in July of last year. This is a ministerial program. AB 2011 projects do not require any review under CEQA, nor do they require any discretionary applications. And that could be a conditional use authorization or a large project authorization. These projects must be located on a site where office, retail, or parking are principally permitted. So this would not be allowed in purely residential zones. There are also on-site affordability requirements, and projects must contain 5 units and be considered code complying. AB 2011 kind of provides 2 different ministerial review programs. One is for 100% affordable projects, which has broader application, and the other is for mixed income housing projects and includes stricter eligibility requirements. AB 2011 and some of the other bills use the term mixed income, which really kind of means market rate with some level of on-site affordable units. There is a notification that is required. It must be made to the California Native American tribes for vacant sites. We already kind of do a very similar notification for all of our SB 35 projects. However, our SB 35 projects require this notification on all sites, whether vacant or not. Projects also must meet minimum construction labor standards, including paying prevailing wage, and for projects of 50 units or more, providing healthcare coverage. There are timelines for review, which are the same as SB 35. It's 90 days from submittal of an application for projects with 150 units or fewer, and 180 days for more than 150 units. So it's very tight timelines for us to complete our review. Eligibility criteria include most of the location criteria within SB 35 that I'll describe in just a moment. In addition, there's some other criteria that restrict the use of a program if it's located too close to a freeway or if it's on a site with industrial uses. So this is the list of the SB 35 location requirements. All of the housing production bills refer to these location requirements in one way or another. They're pretty broad. This does apply statewide, with the exception of hazardous waste sites and maybe a handful of protected habitat areas. Most of these requirements do not apply in San Francisco. So these location-based criteria will be used for all of the housing production bills that I'm going to describe today. So I'm going to start by providing some details just on the mixed income program, since it is a little bit more restrictive than the 100% affordable program. So mixed income projects must not only be located on properties that are zoned for commercial uses, but also on commercial corridors. And commercial corridors are defined as any kind of corridor that's between 70 to 150 feet wide. And this typically means property line to property line and includes the sidewalk. There's also on-site affordability requirements that must be met. As many of you may know, San Francisco's local inclusionary rates were recently reduced, and merging these 2 programs kind of results in the on-site affordability requirements that are shown on this slide. But generally speaking, the affordability requirements are around 15%, and projects can choose to provide either moderate income units for ownership projects. In addition, there are commercial tenant relocation requirements for the mixed income projects. There's also a prohibition on demolition of housing that's been occupied by tenants in the last 10 years, or housing that's been subject to price control or rent control. And then finally, there is a prohibition on demolishing a local, state, or national historic resource as part of this development project. This is also another requirement that you're going to see in many of the following state programs. And it is a bit more protective of historic resources than just state density bonus law itself, which does not have the same protection for locally listed resources, only state resources. So under AB 2011, the 100% affordable program is more flexible than the mixed income program, and more sites are eligible. And this is primarily because it doesn't have to be located on a commercial corridor. So there's still the restriction on the zoning and what it permits, making sure it's commercial, but you don't have to look at the street width. There's also no restriction on the demolition of units or historic resources, provided it's 100% affordable housing. So our affordable housing partners will really need to weigh in which program works best for them. If they needed to demolish a residential unit, maybe AB 2011 is a better option. But if the site is, say, within 500 feet of a freeway, something like SB 35 may work better. Also, any project that demolishes units would also have to comply with all of the replacement provisions of Senate Bill 330, and this was the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. At this point, currently, we have 3 projects that have filed for AB 2011 applications. 2 of them are mixed income, and 1 is 100% affordable. So moving on to SB 423, this is the extension to SB 35, which included 2 programs that involve the construction of at least 2 units. So for jurisdictions that are not meeting their RHNA goals for low income, projects can receive ministerial review when providing at least 50% of the units as affordable. For jurisdictions not meeting RHNA goals for above moderate income, projects receive ministerial review when providing 10% of the units as affordable. And so this affordability requirement for the 10% only applies to projects with 10 units or more. And we're going to generally just kind of frame it as like the 10% requirement. So this 10% requirement or program also allows for ministerial review without affordability requirements for projects with 2 to 9 units. So currently right now, we are subject to the 50% program since we were meeting our RHNA targets for above moderate income. But with the revised targets, we're going to be subject to that 10% requirement as soon as we submit our annual progress report to the state, because we were not able to meet that target for last year. So one effect of the change in program applicability is that any housing project providing on-site inclusionary that meets all of the eligibility standards may be processed with ministerial review. So just a little bit on SB 35, it has been in effect since January of 2018. It has already resulted in the approval of over 3,000 dwelling units. The vast majority of them are 100% affordable. It did create that ministerial approval process for the multifamily housing developments of 2 units or more. The projects do need to be 2/3 residential, and there's no CEQA or discretionary approvals, very similar to AB 2011. There are on-site affordability requirements. In addition, SB 423 included a very unique provision to San Francisco that's going to make this 10% requirement or program effective in the city this year, while other jurisdictions in the Bay Area that are going to be moving from this 50% program to the 10% program due to the increase in RHNA targets will not have to comply to 2027. So we get to test it out for the state. So the eligibility criteria for SB 423 are almost exactly the same as SB 35. There is a prohibition on the demolition of housing, both rent controlled and units occupied by tenants in the last 10 years. So some examples of housing that maybe could be demolished could include like an owner-occupied single-family home, or perhaps owner-occupied condos, because the majority of housing in the city can be subject to rent control. There is that notification to the California Native American tribes, and that remains unchanged. It's required for all properties, regardless of whether it is vacant or not, whereas, AB 2011 only requires it for vacant sites. The labor requirements are very similar to AB 2011, but the prevailing wage requirement kicks in at 11 units. And there's also the addition of a skilled and trained workforce, depending upon the height of the project. But the timeline for review remains unchanged, and it's also the same as the other programs, which is a relief on the implementation side. So because we are very shortly going to be subject to the 10% requirement, we anticipate that this program is going to be much more widely used than SB 35 was in the past. So our local inclusionary program does apply. We do consider it to be an objective standard that must be met for a project to be considered code compliant. And so San Francisco's inclusionary applies to projects with 10 units or more. For SB 423, for projects with more than 10 units, there is the requirement for 10% of the units as affordable. So again, we're in this situation where we have to merge state requirements with local requirements, and the result is kind of what is shown on this slide. Also, please keep in mind too that there are specific areas in the city that have different inclusionary rates, and so all of those we'll have to really look at individually. But the rates that are kind of shown on this slide are really the citywide rates. For projects that have 10 units exactly, only the local inclusionary would apply because SB 423 affordability only kicks in at 11 units. So those projects could theoretically pay the affordable housing fee and receive ministerial review. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there's no local or state affordability requirements for projects between 2 and 9 units. And this is going to be a really important shift in how we process these smaller projects. Therefore, like any project could be considered ministerial if considered code complying and meeting the eligibility criteria. So that can result in no neighborhood notification or discretionary review. Another notable change that SB 423 made to SB 35 is to require a pre-application public hearing, but it's only in certain geographic areas. So if the property is located on the California TCAC HCD opportunity map and is designated as a moderate resource area, a low resource area, or an area of high segregation and poverty, a public hearing at the Planning Commission is required. This must be held within 45 days from the notice of intent to file an SB 423 application. And the notice of intent is not a development application, but it's only going to contain kind of basic plans and a project description. So this hearing is going to be held at the Planning Commission. It would be an informational item, and it's really intended to allow an opportunity for the public to comment as well as the commission. The sponsor will then have to attest that they've reviewed those comments. However, there is no requirement for the sponsor to revise their project based on input from either the commission or the public. So our last housing production bill for tonight, but not quite the last bill, is SB 4, and it became effective January 1st of this year, and it created another ministerial approval process for multifamily housing developments of 2 units or more. And so these projects must be developed by either nonprofit, religious institutions, local public entities, or independent institutions of higher education on land that is owned by these entities. This program is reserved only for 100% affordable housing projects that are considered to be code compliant. The eligibility criteria is very similar to the other programs, but of course, there are definitely some minor deviations. So it includes all of those same kind of SB 35 location criteria, but also contains restrictions for proximity to freeways as well as industrial uses. This is very similar to AB 2011, but of course it's not exactly the same. So for SB4, projects cannot be located within 500 feet of a freeway unless there's MERV 13 air filtration that's installed. Whereas AB 2011 outright prohibits sites that are within 500 feet from a freeway. There's also additional industrial use requirements. There is the restriction on the demolition of housing and historic resources, and these requirements are the same as those for AB 2011 mixed income and SB 35. And then, like AB 2011, tribal notification is only required for vacant sites. Projects must meet similar construction labor standards with some minor deviations, and there are the same timelines for review as the previous programs. We anticipate that SB4 will have some utility in San Francisco, but we also have a lot of different local programs for affordable housing and existing state programs, so may end up being very limited. So switching gears a little bit to state density bonus. For those of you not familiar with state density bonus law, I'm going to provide just a very quick overview. This law was established by the state of California in 1979 as an incentive-based program to provide on-site affordable units. The program has certain eligibility requirements, namely like the project has to contain 5 units or more, it has to be residential or mixed use, and it has to provide on-site affordable units for a period of 55 years. For San Francisco, if those units count towards your inclusionary requirement, then they have to remain affordable for the life of the project. And it's important to kind of think when this came online in 1979, it predates all inclusionary or affordable housing programs throughout the state. State density bonus has 3 components. There's the density bonus, incentives and concessions, as well as waivers. So the amount of density bonus is really dependent on the number of affordable units and the level of affordability that's provided in the project. So if you provide more affordable units, you get additional density. In order to accommodate those extra units, a project may need relief from code requirements, and that relief can come in the form of incentives and concessions or waivers. So the differences in incentive or concession must reduce the cost of the project. You're also limited based on the affordability. A waiver is an exception to a development standard. And so mainly these are kind of volumetric requirements that are really necessary to accommodate the project and the increased density with the requested incentives and concessions. So with these projects, the city is incredibly limited in its discretion, and we can only deny a waiver or an incentive if it is deemed unnecessary or would have a specific adverse impact upon public health or safety or historic resource that's listed on the California Register, and that's all defined by state law. So quickly, just like what that intersection is with the state, or with San Francisco's own inclusionary program. If you consider, let's just say, a 100-unit base project, if the on-site inclusionary rate was something like 20%, then the project is automatically entitled to a density bonus under state density bonus law. And although those bonus units must be market rate and the number of affordable units end up remaining the same, in San Francisco, we do apply the affordable housing fee. And how this kind of works for us is we apply the fee on the entire project, and then we provide a credit for those on-site units to kind of make us whole. So for the last few years, there's almost always an amendment to this statute, to state density bonus law, because it's just, there's been so much increased usage around the state. And so this is where AB 1287 comes into play. We are affectionately calling it the double-double because it really increases the maximum amount of bonus. Previously, state density bonus law kind of capped at a 50% bonus, and now you can get up to a 100% bonus. So AB 1287 allows for additional density and one incentive if the project maxes out on the underlying density bonus. So that's typically, the 50% for rental, 24% for ownership projects. And so this extra bonus can be achieved by providing additional very low or moderate income units. So here is an example project. Let's say you have 100 units with 15% of them restricted at very low income. So you're entitled under the old rules of density bonus to a 50% bonus or 50 units. But if you provide an additional 10% of very low incomes on that same base project, then you're entitled to an additional bonus of 38.75% or 39 units. So your resulting project is 189 units. That's 100 in the base, 50 in the first bonus, and 39 in the second bonus. So the resulting project has a total of 164 market rate units and 25 affordable units, which kind of makes the effective affordability rate of approximately 13%. So switching gears a bit to permit processing, and this will be the last state law for today. AB 1114 will affect all permitting agencies in the city, and it's providing streamlined timelines for review. The bill defines a post-entitlement phase permit. It also imposes requirements to provide sample plans and exhaustive lists of requirements for these types of permits. In addition, the bill sets timelines for review, and this is for all city agencies collectively. And then finally, it prohibits any appeal from the public on these permits, and the only exception being an appeal from the project sponsor. So the definition of a post-entitlement phase permit is shown here. It's pretty lengthy, fairly broad, and it applies to housing development projects with at least one unit that are 2/3 residential. It includes all non-discretionary permits that are required after the entitlement process. It also includes all building permits issued under the California Building Standards Code. So that includes anything from construction, demolition, alterations of building, and that's discretionary or not. So for the city of San Francisco, this includes any building permit for a housing development project. An example could be a site permit that follows a conditional use authorization. But another example could just be a building permit for one unit or more. So there are two different timelines that are stipulated in the bill. One is for completeness, and then the other one is for approval of the permit. So all permitting agencies have 15 business days to determine completeness and provide written notice to the applicant. 15 business days is about 3 weeks. Permitting agencies must be transparent about what is required to have a complete permit. And then if incomplete, the agency has to provide a list to the applicant of all the items that are missing. The applicant may submit the missing materials. However, the agency may not require new items that were not included on either the published list or the first incomplete letter. So it's really to prevent kind of this iterative back and forth with the government agency. So then for any revisions that are submitted, the city will have 15 days review. And if the timelines are not met, then the permit will be considered complete. So the timelines for review of these permits are really dependent upon the size of the project. So the city has 30 business days, which is about 6 weeks, after a complete determination for projects of 25 units or fewer. And then the city has 60 business days after a complete determination for larger projects. So again, the city has to spell out the non-compliance to the applicant, and any revisions, the city must complete review within 30 days and approve the permit. As I'm sure you can imagine, implementation of this bill requires an immense amount of coordination between all of our permitting agencies. The department's been working on an implementation approach for a few months now. We have interagency working groups that are meeting regularly to kind of make sure that we're clearly defining and flagging all of these permits. And the main change too is that we also need to ensure that our review is completed simultaneously by all agencies, since the timelines apply to city review rather than individual departments. For those of you that are familiar with permitting in the city, it's much more sequential and you kind of go from one station to the next. And now we will all be reviewing at the same time. Implementation of the various ministerial programs are also going to be challenging in their own way. You know, we've drafted all of our bulletins to detail implementation of SB 423 as well as SB 4. Our AB 2011 application has already been up, and we have a bulletin on our website. We've revised all of our state density bonus bulletins as well as the applications to reflect the additional bonus and incentive that's now afforded through state law. So what will be the impacts to the role of the Planning Commission? There's going to be some more informational hearings for some of the projects that are subject to SB 423. In many cases, though, code-compliant projects with on-site inclusionary may be considered ministerial, provided that they meet all the eligibility criteria. Finally, code-compliant projects of under 10 units that meet SB 423 eligibility will also receive ministerial review. And this will definitely result in a reduction in discretionary review, as well as conditional use authorizations for demolition. One thing to keep in mind is that a project is not eligible for something like SB 423 if it requires that demolition of rent-controlled housing or housing that's been occupied by tenants in the last 10 years. So although this is a huge and definite change, there are some significant limitations on the demolition of housing. So in closing, I definitely want to just stress, this is really our initial analysis of how these bills are going to be implemented in the city. At this point, the city hasn't published any official guidance, or the state hasn't published any official guidance on these bills. And we may need to adapt if we receive direction from the state to do so. And so this concludes my presentation. I'm, definitely available for questions. And I think Rich Sucre wanted to say a couple of words.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. And thank you for putting together such a great PowerPoint and making it concise. I just wanted to follow up and kind of end with hopefully a positive note on where we are relative to our historic resources program within the city and county of San Francisco. I think right now we are very aware that, the new housing laws have potential to impact some historic buildings, and for anything that's still subject to our CEQA and regulatory review process, nothing has changed relative to how we approach historic resources and how we're conducting our reviews under both our local landmark ordinance as well as through the California Environmental Quality Act. We are actively working with our supervisor's office to look at new landmarks. And we do have our San Francisco citywide survey called SF Survey, which is looking at new historical resources that are popping up throughout our neighborhoods. And so this is one of those aspects of our preservation program that we obviously look for support from many of you out there. And I just want to conclude to state that, I think the department especially recognizes that historic preservation and housing are two essential values that the city has basically committed to over our time, and that we think that these two values can kind of work well hand in hand together, especially as we look towards how the city grows and how we also preserve the important neighborhoods within the city. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you, Kate. People have been asking questions, and I have my own questions, and some folks actually emailed some ahead of time. A few of them kind of revolve around, with all of these bills, what counts as a historic resource. So there's these exemptions, but if I'm correct, all of these bills, these current laws rather, you have to be on the California Register or the National Register, except there is a local landmark, local designation provision in at least one of them, right, Kate?
Actually, for all of the ministerial kind of housing programs, aside for AB 2011, as it were, for the 100% affordable, locally listed resources are protected. It's only state density bonus law that doesn't have that same protection. So if you are, for Article 10 and 11, we're considering anything that's contributory or, altered. We're not considering anything that's either unrated or Category 5 under Article 11 to be considered a resource. But if you do have, 1 through 4 in Article 11 or, Article 10, we would consider that to be a resource. And under SB 4, SB 423, or AB 2011 for mixed income, you'd be prohibited from demolishing those buildings. And furthermore, we've also been able to interpret that although the state bill does say demolition, because Article 10 has a codified definition of demolition, we are using that. So we are applying the Article 10 definition to both, Article 10 and 11 landmarks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
And I do want to
yeah.
make sure we provide a point of distinction. It is designated buildings. So obviously it is not determined eligible. It is basically properties that are located within Article 10, Article 11, the California Register, and the National Register.
Right. So, like, one person asked a question that their house is from 1912 and is in a row that was deemed an eligible historic district, but never designated. So under like SB 423, because it's not designated officially, if somebody wanted to use SB 423, say they live in the house, there's no tenants, everything else works for the program, they could demolish a house in that eligible historic district and then build up to 9 units, I guess, right? So
Right. So, I mean, in 423, I mean, the demolition of like single family homes would be something that,
right.
could be permitted. I think there's a couple other things just at play with SB 423. The minimum project size has to be 2 units. So you'd have to be constructing 2 units. I think the other thing too is, we see a lot of these ministerial programs partner with state density bonus. And state density bonus does have that 5 unit minimum. So with 5 units, that also kind of takes out some of our lower density residential districts like RH1, RH2, et cetera. So when they all kind of like mesh together, it does kind of decrease the eligibility.
Right, because there's a limit to what they can actually put in there. If they want to put 5 units in there, it's not going to maybe pencil out for them to stuff those in there, essentially. So some people ask some questions about the state density bonus and then to the current zoning. We're still like working with the current zoning we have right now, though, right? Yeah. So, and then as far as like somebody asked about this, and I thought this was kind of interesting. I'm going to try to read it out the way Dennis wrote it because I understand what he's saying, but it's a little complicated. How does the constraints reduction ordinance requirement for conditional use for demolition of rent-controlled units and historic resources play out vis-a-vis the Housing Accountability Act? So does that make sense to you? He's based the new constraints reduction ordinance.
Man, let me see here. So let me see if
so I guess it's more like
yeah.
Conditional use. Yeah. So
Correct. I mean, I think for Housing Accountability Act, the projects have to be considered code compliant.
right.
So, just because there is a conditional use process doesn't necessarily take it out of code compliance. So, I think we'd have to look at each one, each project definitely individually, but let's say it needed some sort of exception, some sort of variance, there was something where it wasn't code compliant, then it would not be subject to the Housing Accountability. I'm sorry, if it needed it, then it would not be subject to the Housing Accountability Act. Too many negatives.
And then a few people have asked, because, everything is about objective standards now. So for as far as like historic resources or historic, here, I'll actually read somebody's question. I think it's easier. So I guess Rich Hillis had said that the planning department will create and publish design standards and wondering if there's objective historic design standards and where would the department be in creating those, since objective standards are kind of everything with all these laws now.
Yeah, and that's accurate. So like keep in mind that much of Article 10 and 11 in some of our districts have some objective standards relative towards how we would evaluate alterations and new construction within those districts. We do have this on our work plan for production over the next year, being mindful that we want to basically get the citywide objective design standards adopted, and that we will likely move forward with something specialized for historic resources.
Okay. And then I guess there were people were asking also about, I mean, I'm getting a lot of calls on essentially the rezoning having to do with the housing element, which it's getting a lot of press right now. And how do these bills intersect with this higher zoning? Is it just that if you want to use one of these programs and the zoning changes, you can build more, or is there actually any sort of relationship between the housing element rezoning and these new housing production bills?
Totally. And I can definitely defer to Esmeralda to definitely expand on this. But I think, with some of the ministerial programs, there's still that ability to use those ministerial programs in conjunction with the rezoning. I think state density bonus law is slightly different. I think that's something that we're kind of working through right now. But um, with some of the ministerial programs, there wouldn't be a prohibition on being able to use them, provided you meet all the eligibility criteria.
Yeah. And with all the accelerated timeline you guys are now under for all the permits, do you have, I mean, how are you actually doing that? Because I often feel like it's a tight squeeze in a normal situation. Are you actually getting more funding or more staff to deal with this?
We just have superpowers. No, I'm,
Yeah.
I think we definitely have to kind of look at just how our department is this being staffed, and we also need to understand like how many of these we're really going to get. I mean, when we talk about something like AB 2011 and some of the labor standards and whatnot, I mean, those are really no joke in terms of the feasibility of a project. So, I mean, I think there's just going to have to be kind of a shift in how we staff. If we end up seeing things that have more ministerial review and less CEQA, we may have to do some reorganization, but so far, I think we're kind of, we're hanging in there. But yes, they are very aggressive timelines for sure.
And then just real quick, I know I've talked to Rich about this, but I think it's kind of important to share. It seems like if designation is everything with these, at least as far as how they relates to these housing production laws, um, how do we have 120,000 parcels in San Francisco, and I don't know what fraction of that is actually designated. There's only 300 or something individual Article 10 landmarks. And then when you throw in the conservation districts, it's not that much compared to what is eligible, right? What we know could be a landmark or be in a district. So how do we fast track that? How do we take the locally designated landmarks that, say, for example, are not included in some of the bills? Like the state density bonus really just considers California register, right? So how do we fast track and batch the landmarks that we've already worked so hard to designate to be protected or at least included in all of these other housing production exclusions?
I would just say is advocate more with your supervisor, right?
Get more landmarks nominated, you mean?
Well, I think that's a key part of it, right? Like the Historic Preservation Commission and our staff can do quite a lot. Making sure that we understand what's important to our communities is paramount. I think that's one aspect of it. And I think we also have to make sure that we have a balanced conversation so that way people don't view historic preservation as anti-housing in particular. I don't think that serves anyone in terms of the kind of larger good that, the city both needs housing. It also needs historic buildings. It needs great neighborhoods. And we are able to kind of strike a balance between that. And I think the city has been pretty successful with that. It's funny, Woody, you said that right now about 1% of the city, less than 1% of the city is designated, right?
Right.
And then about 14% of the city is right now some form of category, what we call category A or historic property as a whole. So we have a pretty rich history here, and it does deserve recognition. I think particularly when we talk about landmarking, it is about celebrating our best, right? And making sure that like we do go into it with that mindset, that we can do it. And obviously I will happily take more staff. I will happily take whatever kind of help that our amazing historians and consultant community can do. But it does start at the local level, and it does start with advocacy and making sure that like we are promoting the kind of good parts of historic preservation and what it can do for the city.
I mean, I'm with you, Rich, and I do think that the city in the past thought about historic preservation very seriously when it faced, projects or had to make decisions on things. I guess what feels like it's changed is it's being pulled a lot out of the local municipalities' hands. And so I guess I want to make sure we have an advocate at the state who feels the same way about the special places that we need to preserve, and we need to make sure are kept for the future while we add density and housing to our cities. So I guess it's to me, it feels like a two-pronged thing. Like, how in the short term do we manage these housing laws? And how in the longer term do we make sure that we are, including, especially on our side, the locally designated properties that we go through a long, involved process to get, designation. So I guess, we've talked about this. I'd like to see if there's some way we can at least get our Article 10, Article 11 properties on the California Register in the short term, so that, we can continue to work on the laws, but in the short term, we don't want to lose any landmarks, right?
Yeah, and I'll say we have been in conversation with the State Historic Preservation Office, our SHPO. We are awaiting some additional guidance. Our Historic Preservation Commission has directed our staff to do outreach with the SHPO to see specifically about how we do get some buildings on the California Register. I will say a constraint that we do have relative to state or federal designation is owner consent. We do not require owner consent for Article 10 or Article 11, but on the state or federal register, it's required. And so that is why also it's important to advocate with both the property owners and make sure that people understand like the good parts of preservation and the good parts of like what it does for both community and, for the city as a whole.
I think you're going to get more homeowner or more property owners interested in designation now than you would have in the past. So,
And Woody, if I could just add one
yeah,
more quick thing, it's
sure.
only state density bonus that doesn't have this protection for the locally,
Right.
listed resources. But state density bonus is, it's also from 1979. It's been kind of hard to amend, I think, politically to make it more restrictive, of course.
Right.
But the protection that actually has for those California listed resources is that if the commission or government agency can make findings that there's a specific adverse impact to that resource, then we could potentially deny a waiver or deny an incentive or concession. It doesn't necessarily like rule out, complete eligibility. I mean, I think we can come to a pretty logical conclusion that an adverse impact would include demolition. But I also do think that, this is in concert with all these ministerial programs. I think there's going to be a lot of projects that are going to want to take advantage of them. And when you take advantage of those programs, then you're back into that local protection.
Right.
Because if you don't take a ministerial program, you just use a conventional state density bonus path, you are still subject to CEQA. So any sort of, effect on any type of resource is going to have to go through that, really intense kind of environmental review process and be analyzed. So there is a little bit of guardrail there just for the resources if it's state density bonus and not also ministerial.
I think there was a good question in the chat, Kate, that I wanted to bring up.
I haven't even opened
specifically regarding, does the state density bonus trump AB 2011 protections for historic resources, especially local landmarks?
No, it's actually the inverse. So AB 2011, if you want to use it, then you get the full protection for locally listed. That's kind of exactly what I was just trying to describe. Maybe it was a little bit too long-winded, but definitely if you want to get the advantage of the ministerial review, which I'm assuming from the development community is this really expedited process and not having to go through CEQA, you have to meet those eligibility criteria.
So which means you would not be allowed to demolish a locally listed landmark, a state landmark, or a city, a federal landmark. So.
Okay.
And then as far as, people are asking, and you brought it up, Rich, about CEQA, there's a lot of sort of confusion or a lot of like misinformation maybe going around about how the city is treating CEQA these days. Has anything changed in your department about how you do like a review of a historic property?
For anything that is subject to CEQA, our process is still the same that it has always been.
Okay.
Our staff, keep in mind, under CEQA, we do twofold review, which is one, to identify if a building is historic or not, and then two, to identify if there are impacts to a historic building that's present. And so that process has not changed. While we may have like cleaned up some of our applications and kind of tried to provide some new guidance to that effect, the core duties of what we do under CEQA relative to historic resources has not been impacted by all of this.
Okay. And then real quick, since we were talking about the upzoning and we have our bench team here, the rezoning, So how does the preservation team at planning fold into the rezoning plan as part of the housing element? Do you have representation in that? I mean, how does that actually, how do you
Sure.
intersect?
I can take that. Yeah, we're in active conversation and part of the teams that are helping to develop the rezoning plan. So we work alongside of our citywide staff, and we have members of our preservation staff that are working in concert with the rezoning efforts that are going on.
Mhm. All right. Well, I think this, like you said, Kate, there's more than 60 bills I think the governor signed last year having to do with housing or housing production. And there's still a lot more in the pipe that are coming down. Um, as far as like San Francisco Heritage feels, this is not the city, this is not the planning department. I do think that the game has changed in the sense that we have to be a lot more active in our advocacy and elevating the importance of historic buildings and landscapes at the state level. I think we always had good partnerships with people in the city. We could work with our supervisors, and we kind of knew how things worked in San Francisco. But I do feel like it's changed quite a bit, and we're going to have a louder voice in Sacramento to make sure people understand what preservation is and what it isn't. Um, I think anybody who's kind of follows preservation knows that there's a lot more press that is casting preservation as an anti-housing tool or movement or a way to block housing. But it's sort of just cherry picking certain areas and not really understanding the full breadth of what preservation is. So it's like it's a very tall task ahead of us, but I do appreciate both of you helping to shed some light on how the city is dealing with these state housing production bills. And I hope we can like do something like this again soon. It's very informative for me to actually have you guys here and go through these examples. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So everybody who's come, we did record this. We are recording this, and I'm going to share it in the next couple of days, so you can share it with other folks. I am saving your questions. I will try to get back to folks that didn't get their answer. You can also reach out to me or San Francisco Heritage. Just go to sfheritage.org, and you can email me there. Sign up for our email list. We'll probably do more of these in the future. And thank you for coming tonight, and for learning a little bit more about state housing law and preservation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much.